right, hello, welcome, video 3. Um, I'm diving into this. I'm going into the Israeli-Hamas negotiations and the larger Middle East strategy, if you could call it that. Um, Israel and Hamas negotiations to fit into any kind of structure that we've been talking about or terminology that we've been talking about seems almost difficult in itself. But I'm going to try to give some background and is up to date of where the conflict is and how it is starting to spiral throughout the Middle East, and what other players are doing in connection to the negotiations or to promote negotiations between the two parties. So it seems that Israel and Hamas's negotiations, if they can fit into any terminology, are competitive, coercive, adversarial, and draconian. Any negotiations are rooted in long and volatile history and value conflicts that traditional conflict resolution mechanisms seem impossible to solve. Additionally, given the asymmetrical power balance and sheer numbers of those killed, I do not see how a best alternative negotiated agreement, a banta, could even be found at this point in the situation. But to introduce the conflict and the stakeholders involved, if one were to draw a diagram at who is shooting at whom in the Middle East, it would look increasingly like something like a bowl of spaghetti. What began in October as a war between Israel and Hamas has now drawn in militants from 4 other Arab states. In addition, Iran, Israel, and Jordan all bombed Syria this month. Iran also unexpectedly bombed Pakistan, which must be wondering how it too got dragged into this mess. Now, nearly its 5th month, the war in Gaza seems far from an end, despite growing sense in Israel that the fighting has gotten bogged down. The Israeli army has yet to find the top leaders of Hamas or most of the Israeli hostages the group is still holding. Moreover, Israel's political and security officials worry that the bargaining or negotiating in any meaningful way at this point will undermine the military gains they have made. Since October 7th, the Middle East's 3 strongest powers have all had to reassess their security doctrines. Israel's military primacy has been shaken. Iran's proxies are now becoming a liability for Iran, and America has been dragged back into a region it wanted to leave, and in an election year. None seem sure how to proceed. As the Gaza war drags on, a messier regional conflict just keeps expanding. On January 20th, Iranian-backed militants in Iraq fired a large number of rockets and ballistic missiles at America's Al-Asad air base in western Iraq. Most were intercepted by Patriot air defense batteries, but some hit the base and wounded Americans and Iraqis. The barrage followed days of Iranian attacks across the region at alleged terrorists in Syria and Pakistan, and at a supposedly Israeli spy base in Iraqi Kurdistan, killing a Kurdish businessman at his home with his family. The strike in Pakistan invited retaliatory attacks on Iran, though both sides seem now to be avoiding any further fighting. Yet America is trying to find a balance. President Joe Biden has been cautious. He does not want to be drawn into another war in the Middle East, and certainly not in this election year. In Iraq and Syria, American forces are responding far less often than they are attacked. The American campaign against the Houthis began only after repeated warnings and a UN security resolution condemning the group's attacks on shipping. Mr. Biden admits that the strikes have not deterred the Houthis, but also says they will continue. His best hope is that Israel will soon wind down the war in Gaza, which many of his allies have demanded for months. So, quote from Al Jazeera: Israel Katz, Israel's foreign minister, met his European counterparts just recently on January 22nd to discuss what happens after the war. Diplomats in Brussels said the two sides talked past each other. The Europeans wanted to talk about who would govern and rebuild Gaza, and how they might pursue a two-state solution between Israelis and Palestinians. Mr. Katz, however, touted a pet project to build an artificial island off Gaza's coast that would serve as a seaport, something he promoted during his stint as transport minister in 2017. His interlocutors were stunned. Quote, "This didn't have much to do with what we were discussing," said Joseph Borrell, the EU's top diplomat. End quote from Al Jazeera. The chaos in the Red Sea has caused only modest economic damage to Israel. Most of its sea trade goes through the Mediterranean ports. Egypt has paid a far bigger price. According to The Economist, it has seen a 40% reduction in revenue from the Suez Canal, a vital resource of hard currency for the country. Israel is promoting a deal, probably both financially and security motivated from itself. This deal would come in two stages. First would be a, quote, humanitarian release of civilian hostages in return for a truce that could last several weeks, or perhaps a month or even two. Israel would also free hundreds of Palestinian prisoners. The second stage would free captive Israeli soldiers in exchange for a full ceasefire, an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza, and the release of even more Palestinians, probably thousands of them. Hamas is divided over the deal. Its political leaders, shuttling between Doha and Cairo for talks, are in favor of accepting the first stage of the agreement. They are aware that holding civilian hostages continues to damage their cause. But the leaders in Gaza want Israel to withdraw before another release of hostages. Their demand that Israel free Hamas terrorists who took part in the October massacre is another potential deal breaker, since Israel is highly unlikely to accept that condition. So, to kind of reconcile this with some of the readings for this session, so many historical examples led to this, or historical elements led to this war in Gaza. Israel has for decades taken a directly coercive stance in Gaza. A few of the readings in this session, in their definitions, seem to nearly predict an entrenched conflict such as this, especially Chapter 9 on negotiated and non-negotiated settlements. A couple of examples and why this outsized conflict might fit the terminology of forms of negotiation. So from Chapter 9 in your book, Bruce, at times settlements are enshrined in law and treaties. Other times adversaries simply declare victory and disengage with each other, even though no fundamental change in their relationship or the conditions that underlie their incomparability occurred. Ceasefires between Israel and Hamas at the end of the bloody confrontations in 2014 and 2021 serve as good examples. Such settlements are usually fragile and temporary. Again, nearly predicting what's happening now, that there was no resolution, there was no forward mobility for the for the Palestinians, so coercive use of power alienates others, damages social relations, and creates new grievances by the defeated side. The result is usually a situation of negative peace. Overt hostility has ended, but the drivers of the conflict, such as a lack of integration, inequality, and hostile intergroup narratives, often remain. Moreover, success lasts only if the pressure is maintained. Once the coercive pressures are removed, an active phase of conflict begins again. These disadvantages are most apparent in settlements involving parties that are in an ongoing relationship where past actions become the prelude to a new phase of conflict. In these cases, the settlement is destructive, joint damage is done, which again is just what we're seeing now. Also, on the political side, tactics that commit the negotiator to a position staked out and leave little room for maneuver are frequently made, such as Netanyahu is doing and his far-right coalition. For example, leaders may take their positions public and even announce them prior to negotiations, so that they would suffer a loss of face if they later backed down. They may also say that they cannot change their positions because of constraints imposed by the constituencies, who would not support any decision. Again, this is directly where Netanyahu, almost to save, trying to be impartial here, but maybe to save his own political career, is doing exactly that. So if we follow the reading that to understand constructive negotiations, each adversary must first believe in three things. First, that a joint settlement of the contested issues is possible. Second, that an integrative settlement will yield a better outcome than a unilaterally imposed settlement. And third, that the interests of either side are legitimate and must be given some recognition. Both sides are guilty in this conflict of not even being able to legitimately recognize the other as having territory, and then that goes into all the history of the Israeli resettlement um, and all of that conflict is way too big of this. I'm just trying to use some of our terminology to see how this can be fit in, or if it can't. Um, but unfortunately for me, we find none of these options available to Israel and Hamas. The best, albeit slim, hope seems to be outside negotiations themselves from other state actors who are being affected in the Middle East, having enough coercive power to ultimately bring these two together for meaningful or something like a lasting um, resolution. However, this conflict is so entrenched in values, culture, territory, history, religion that it's hard to see how resolution um, could could stand at this point. Earlier today, the UN High Court rejected South America's claim that Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. One of the most interesting, I would say, behind the scenes, and it's hard to get information about this for me. But one of the interesting behind the scenes negotiations that I've heard is emerging dialogue between China and Iran. Perhaps this will evolve into something productive. Um, if China can assert political pressure on Iran in their negotiations to defuse their proxies, especially given the chaotic past week, um, that that may lead to a solution. Um, or maybe not a solution, but at least a narrative towards a solution. Um, how I've only been able to find reference to these talks between China and Iran in two Al Jazeera pieces and in one piece in The Economist. Um, but if there's anything physically left of Gaza at the end, or in the negotiation at the end of negotiations, if there are any, and if Israel has any moral standing left in the international stage, still remains to be seen. All right, thanks.